history of the founding. Now we're going to look at how did we become the United States of America. What do you think are some of the things that led to the United States becoming an independent sovereign nation? Now this comes from the London magazine in 1774, 2 years before the Declaration. In this pictorial in the London magazine, we can see America depicted as a First Nation Native American woman who is currently being violated by 3 individuals. These individuals represent the Tory party, right? Just like we have Republicans and Democrats, they had Tories and Whigs. One is called Lord Sandwich, the other one is Lord Mansfield, and up here we have Lord North. Lord North was the Prime Minister, equivalent to a chief executive like a president. And he's pouring bitter draught or bitter tea, and the prediction is that the tea will spew back into his face. In his pocket, he has the Boston Port Bill, where Britain was going to close the Boston port, all right? The Boston petitions are trampled underfoot at the bottom of the picture. Now, there's a lady looking away, that is the United Kingdom, refusing to acknowledge the atrocities that are happening to America. You see a gentleman with a sword. The sword is written military law, right? He has a Scott Brute hat. He's military. In other words, the way Britain is going to deal with the badly behaved or misbehaved Americans is by using military law. Finally, there are 2 gentlemen to the far right, far left of the screen, and that is France with the clothing. You can tell that's France, that's Spain. They're looking at this scenario and they're trying to decide what is going to happen, right? Now, going back, we have to go to what transpired. We have the French-Indian War. Now, the French-Indian War was part of the 7 Years' War. The French-Indian War fought in this continent. Now, according to the British perspective, Americans were the net beneficiary of the war, and therefore they ought to pay for the war. And so the British Parliament begins to pass acts that were very unpopular. Now, you have to keep in mind, about a decade or so before this, the Americans were fighting alongside the British. For example, famously, George Washington fought along the British in the French-Indian War against France. And about a decade or so later, Britain would completely mismanage the situation and lose almost half a continent. So you have the Townshend Acts, the Tea Levy Acts, and whenever you put taxes at the border, when you're trying to ship things like tea and other things, you cause yourself, or you cause that entity or that group to be less profitable in a global market. So we call those tariffs. So if I tariff your tea at the border and you're producing tea at $2, right? When it crosses the border, if I put a tax of $2, now your tea, when you're trying to sell it, is $4. But you're competing with other groups like the Dutch India Company, right? And so they're still selling their tea for $2, all right? And so these less profitability, global competition, Americans do not like all these taxations, and they begin to argue that they need a place on the table when it comes to matters that affect their day-to-day lives. But that's not the British perspective. To the British, there are other places they rule without providing representation. So why are Americans complaining, right? And so you have revolts like the Boston Tea Party, led by Samuel Adams, brother to John Adams, president number 2. You have the First Continental Congress assembled together by the Americans to decide their fate for the future. Eventually, bullets are fired. King George declares the 13 colonies rebels, right? He's willing to use military power to put badly behaved children in line. And then finally, the Declaration of Independence is signed. And so now America is willing to go back to the state of nature. Now, as we were looking, there were other groups of people who were looking from the side, the French and the Spaniards, if you remember. So the French joined in 78, Spain in 79, and then the Dutch Republic. Now America has allies, right? Not to point out examples in history, but most recently, Russia was to take Ukraine in 2 weeks. But once allies came in, it became quite difficult. In the same like when America went to Vietnam and had to fight with the Viet Cong. And so a bunch of external support and guerrilla warfare, amongst many other things, caused it very difficult for the British to simply overcome these 13 ragtag colonies. The British find themselves fighting wars in multiple continents, limited to any allies. Eventually, Lord Cornwallis will surrender. And the other party, the Whig Party, will take power in Great Britain and be willing to recognize America as a sovereign state. Now, if you can remember, Locke, that once you break your bonds with government, you go back to the state of nature to recreate. You need a what? A new social contract. And so some early draft of social contracts began to emerge. For example, the Albany Plan from Benjamin Franklin, argued to have been copied from an Iroquois system that was from Chief Hiawatha, if I'm completely not pronouncing his name correctly, but a confederation of 6 nations, right? So the argument, he borrowed that idea of a confederacy from them. There's John Dixon, who brought in the name the United States of America, the idea that we need a national government that can collect taxes, that can hold and manage lands to the west, right? So these are early drafts of an idea that America needs a new social contract in that we have broken our bonds of affection with Great Britain. Eventually, the social contract we'll create is a new government called what? The Articles of Confederation, right? So under the Articles of Confederation, there are several challenges, right? It's a weak government. If you can remember the different forms or systems of government. You have a confederacy where the states are stronger than the national government. You have a federal system where there's a balancing of power. And then you have a unitary system or centralized system where the national government is the one who has the power, and the state or regional governments work on the behalf of the national government. All right? So the United States enacts this confederacy. The United States are not as united as one would think. In fact, it becomes the unofficial social contract of America in 78, and Maryland will be the last state to be forced to join by France. All right? And so you can see the states have just broken away from a very strong system under the British. They have no appetite to go under national government, but the necessity of a common enemy forces them to have to come together, and they need to do things like foreign affairs, for example. France has to deal with one united front. It cannot deal with 13 different fronts, right? And so for this reason, the articles come in. But they're structurally weak in a time where America has a lot of challenges, right? The states voluntarily are giving support. The army is not even well funded because of the dysfunction of the Continental Congress, right? And so, for example, Benjamin Franklin is argued to have appealed to Robert Morris, the richest man at the time, to try and deal with America's financial systems, and he even had a challenge to deal with this. And so it's a very weak, very limited, dysfunctional national government that they create. Now, America is a free nation. Now what? Right? And for those who've watched Hamilton the musical, I normally say that's when King Charles sings, or King George sings, you'll be back or you'll be sorry. All right, so America won the war of attrition, which means you outlast your opponent. Whether it's through guerrilla warfare, getting allies, hit and runs, eventually a stronger opponent gives up. And so the Whigs take over power. Lord North and his Tories are kicked out of power. In fact, some wanted to prosecute him, Lord North, in Britain, right? But anyway, Britain has lost. Now, even when the Treaty of Peace of September 3rd, 1783, or the Treaty of Paris, between Great Britain, America, and its allies is signed, it's supposed to come to the states for ratification. Now, you needed at least 9 out of 13 states for anything to be official, especially when it comes to amending the Constitution and dealing with treaties and things that were major. When it comes to the United States, only 7 states showed up. And actually, Madison stated that they needed to wait until they had a large enough forum. So officially, January 14th, 1787 is the day they ratified, and America is recognized as legally and officially a sovereign state. Now, most countries in the world, when they celebrate Independence Day, they are celebrating the day they ratify the Treaty of Peace and recognition of their self-sovereignty. But in America, we celebrate the Declaration of Independence, but that's just beside the point, right? So January 14th is Ratification Day. So, the United States is a sovereign, independent, free country. A few things to point out. Now, one on leadership, George Washington. George Washington retires as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and turns his power over to Congress. Now, that is quite significant because at the time, military leaders who lead their countries through revolution or major political change remain in power de facto for life. And they pass the power to their children. So it was quite interesting. It was not common that George Washington just chose to retire and give up military might. And therefore, I would argue the norm of having the civilians over the military was well established, and one of the reasons here we can see, if not George Washington, right? However, nonetheless, America is in great debt, has borrowed heavily to fight this war, and those debts need to be paid. Other challenges abound. One example is border disputes, right? Which states own what? Does Connecticut claim the top part of Pennsylvania? Do they own land to the west, including Massachusetts? And so the question is, who owns what? And how do we resolve these border disputes? Those are still going on. And we have a very weak government, for that matter, under the Articles of Confederation. On top of this, you have a generation of military troops who have suffered under the Articles without proper funding. Historically, some argue that at a particular battle in Valley Forge, that George Washington and his troops actually were starving, right? And so there is the idea that some military troops actually want to have a coup d'etat. They want to take over government, right? And so these are some of the challenges that are being seen in the United States. And George Washington, once again, is attributed as playing a pivotal role in stopping military officers from taking over government. We call it a coup d'etat, when the military takes over government. And in fact, in many places in the world, we have seen they have a history where military troops and generals have taken over power and ran the country. All right. But former military troops like Alexander Hamilton have a suggestion of maybe it's time to move on to a new system. Furthermore, mobs are springing everywhere in the country, including the Shades Rebellion, where they're losing land, the economy is not looking good. They take over the Massachusetts State House. And so the country is set to implode in itself. If you know anything about the history of new countries, either you implode into civil war, or you have rule by mobs, or you have a strong military junta or military group that takes over and rules with the iron fist. Okay, that's normally the genesis of many states when they go through a revolution, right, or major political shift. And so, why didn't America implode? Why didn't America go into the way of becoming a dictatorship? We can attribute this to the genius of some of the founding fathers in the idea that they realized and recognized they were under the wrong form of government. That the Articles of Confederation was not adequate enough to meet what they need. Remember, according to Locke, government is created to fulfill several purposes for the people, all right? That's why they leave the state of nature. Whenever a government can no longer fulfill its obligation, the people have the moral right to end their relationship with that government, go back to the state of nature, and create a new social contract. And so that's when we see Madison beginning to pan the Virginia Plan and to propose a bicameral legislature, amongst many other things. You have the Federalist Papers, 85 essays, majority penned by Hamilton, they're penned by John Jay, they're penned by Madison. And these gentlemen played major positions, right? Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury. Madison was a Secretary of State and a President. John Jay, first Chief Justice of the United States. So very prominent thinkers were trying to write and pen and philosophize over what would be the best form of government for America in the future. So those were the Federalist Papers. And just in interesting fashion, Hamilton came from one side of the political wing, Madison from another one. Hamilton was an immigrant from the Caribbean, Madison Virginian, right? So a nice set of individuals came together, right? So there's a drafting of the Constitution in 87, ratification in 88, 89, George Washington becomes the President of the United States. The Constitution becomes the law of the land in 89. DC becomes the capital in 90, right? Now, that is the founding of the United States.